Have you ever trusted a belief so deeply that you never stopped to ask where it came from? A belief repeated so often that it stopped sounding like an opinion and started feeling like fact. In military circles, in quiet briefings and unguarded conversations, there has long been a convenient assumption. That elite capability belongs to nations with long winters, vast budgets, and polished doctrines written in old academies. And beneath that assumption, another thought quietly followed. That soldiers from smaller, poorer countries may be brave, but not refined. Tough, but not elite. It was rarely said out loud. It didn't need to be. It lived in smirks during joint exercises, in patient explanations delivered a little too slowly, in laughter shared between foreign operators who assumed no one else could hear or understand. People spoke as if the world had already agreed, as if the hierarchy of military excellence had been decided long ago, with no room left for surprise. Then came a joint training operation in Southeast Asia, deep in jungle terrain that maps could barely describe. It was not meant to humiliate anyone. It was not designed to prove a point. It was simply another cooperative exercise, another line on a schedule. Among the visiting forces was a highly respected French Special Operations Unit, men with a proud lineage, shaped by European counterterrorism doctrine, precision planning, and generations of institutional confidence. They arrived disciplined, professional, and quietly amused by what they expected to encounter. Across from them stood Filipino operators, calm, observant, unassuming. No dramatic speeches, no visible irritation, just steady eyes and relaxed posture. The kind that comes from people who have learned not to waste energy proving themselves. Some of the French soldiers exchanged glances. A soft laugh here, a comment there. Jungle warfare, they thought, was just another environment. Terrain could be studied. Techniques could be adapted. Experience would do the rest. What they did not understand was that for the Filipinos, this environment was not an assignment. It was home. The jungle was not something to conquer. It was something to read, to respect, to move with, rather than against. Long before this exercise, these operators had trained in heat that crushed the lungs, in rain that erased visibility, in regions where mistakes were not corrected in classrooms, but remembered in silence. The scenario itself looked simple enough on paper. A simulated operation designed to test coordination, awareness, and adaptability under pressure. Limited visibility. Unreliable communication. A hostile environment meant to level the field. To the planners, it was balanced. To the Filipino operators, it felt familiar. As preparations began, there was still that unspoken confidence hanging in the air, the sense that outcomes were predictable, that some forces were meant to lead and others to follow. No one anticipated a lesson. No one expected humility to become the most important takeaway of the day. And yet, as the jungle closed in and the exercise unfolded, something began to shift. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to unsettle certainty. Because sometimes the most powerful reversals begin not with explosions or commands, but with the quiet realization that what you believed was solid ground may never have been solid at all. As the exercise moved closer, the contrast between the two groups became more visible, not through words, but through habits. The French operators relied on checklists, rehearsed signals, and precise timing. Every movement was measured, every decision weighed against doctrine learned in classrooms and reinforced in simulations. It was impressive, disciplined, and undeniably professional. Yet there was an underlying tension, a subtle friction between plan and place. The jungle did not care about timelines. It swallowed sound, bent light, and turned certainty into guesswork. The Filipino operators prepared differently. There was less talking, fewer visible rehearsals. They adjusted gear quietly, checked one another with quick glances, and spent long moments simply observing the terrain. To an outside eye, it could look casual, almost relaxed. But beneath that calm was something forged over years of operating where margins for error were thin. Many of these men had grown up in regions shaped by conflict, disaster, and scarcity. Training was not an abstract concept for them. It was survival refined into instinct. For some, the road here had been brutal. Limited funding meant improvisation. Aging equipment meant learning to rely on senses rather than technology. Operations against real threats meant that failure carried consequences far beyond debriefings. There were stories they did not tell easily. Nights without sleep, friends lost, communities caught between violence and poverty. In those conditions, confidence was not loud. It was quiet and deeply internal. As the briefing concluded, there was a moment that passed almost unnoticed. A French operator glanced at the map again, frowned slightly, then looked up at the canopy overhead. The paths marked on paper did not exist in the way he expected. The terrain was alive, shifting, refusing to conform. Nearby, a Filipino operator traced a route with his finger, not on the map, but on the ground itself, reading broken branches, damp soil, and patterns invisible to those unfamiliar with the land. When the exercise began, the jungle immediately asserted itself. Heat pressed down, heavy and unrelenting. Radios crackled, then fell silent. Visual contact disappeared within meters. The French team moved with confidence at first, executing their plan as designed. But slowly, small disruptions accumulated. A delayed signal, a misjudged distance, a sound that could not be placed. The Filipino operators moved differently. They flowed rather than advanced, adjusting pace without spoken commands. They communicated with subtle cues, body language shaped by years of working together. They anticipated problems before they surfaced, not because they predicted the enemy, but because they understood the environment. To them, the jungle was speaking constantly. Tension built quietly, not panic, but uncertainty, the kind that seeps in when familiar tools begin to fail. The French team adapted, as elite soldiers do, but adaptation takes time, and time was something the scenario did not offer generously. Somewhere in that dense green maze, a realization began to form, not yet fully conscious but unsettling all the same. This was not about who had better equipment or longer pedigrees. This was about who belonged in the moment. And as the exercise unfolded, that question grew heavier with every step forward. Somewhere deep inside the exercise, the rhythm changed. It was not marked by a whistle or a command, but by a feeling, a subtle awareness that one side was no longer reacting, but anticipating. The jungle seemed to open and close around the Filipino operators as if it recognized them. Leaves brushed shoulders without sound. Footsteps disappeared into damp earth. Breathing slowed, not from fear, but from familiarity. For the French team, the situation was becoming difficult to read. Their movements were disciplined, but every step forward felt heavier than the last. The heat pressed into their backs. Sweat blurred vision. Signals that should have been clear arrived late or not at all. They were trained for chaos, but this chaos had a personality. It did not rush. It waited. Then came the first moment of stillness. A pause that felt longer than it was. One French operator raised his hand, signaling a halt. He had sensed something. Not danger exactly, but absence. The forest felt too quiet. In that silence, a realization flickered. They were no longer setting the tempo. The Filipino operators had already adjusted. They moved in arcs rather than lines, closing space without announcing it. Communication passed through the smallest gestures, a tilt of the head, a hand resting briefly on a shoulder. No wasted motion, no urgency, only intent. This was not bravado. It was patience refined by years of operating where rushing often meant failing. As the scenario progressed, the gap widened. Objectives that seemed secure were quietly compromised. Positions thought hidden were observed. Routes assumed safe were already known. The French team adapted, changing formations, revising assumptions, doing everything elite soldiers are trained to do. But adaptation takes time, and the Filipino operators had already moved past that phase. They were operating on intuition shaped by lived experience. There was no celebration in their actions, no visible triumph, only focus. To them, this was not a contest of pride, it was simply execution. The jungle, with all its unpredictability, felt less like an obstacle and more like an ally. Every sound carried meaning, every shadow told a story. When the final moments unfolded, the outcome became impossible to ignore. One by one, the exercise's decisive markers were reached, not through force, but through positioning, not through speed, but through awareness. The realization landed quietly among the French operators, heavier than any shouted result. They had been outmaneuvered, not by superior equipment, but by deeper understanding. As the exercise concluded, there was no laughter this time, no whispered jokes, only thoughtful silence. Helmets came off, eyes met. Respect replaced assumption. Somewhere between the heat and the stillness, something fundamental had shifted. The score would later be spoken aloud, clear and undeniable. But what lingered longer was not the number, it was the feeling of having witnessed something unexpected. A reminder that mastery does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it moves quietly through the jungle, confident not because it needs to prove anything, but because it already knows exactly who it is. What happened after the exercise mattered just as much as what happened during it. As the jungle slowly released its grip and the final signals were called, there was no cheering, no raised fists, no victory poses. The Filipino operators emerged quietly, faces calm, breathing steady, as if they had simply completed another routine patrol. For them, this was not a moment to celebrate. It was a moment to reset, to check on one another, to make sure everyone came back whole. That restraint spoke louder than any words. The French operators gathered nearby, helmets coming off one by one. Sweat-soaked, exhausted, reflective. The confidence they had arrived with had not vanished, but it had changed shape. It was no longer certainty. It was curiosity, edged with humility. A few of them replayed moments in their minds, trying to understand when control slipped away. Others simply stood still, absorbing the weight of what had just happened. There was a brief pause before anyone spoke. In that silence, something rare unfolded. Pride did not harden into denial. Instead, it softened into respect. A French team leader stepped forward, his voice measured, no trace of irony left. He acknowledged what everyone already knew, but needed to hear spoken aloud. That what they had witnessed was not luck, not coincidence, not an imbalance in rules. It was mastery. The Filipino operators listened politely, eyes lowered, nodding slightly. No long explanations followed, no need to defend their methods. Their confidence did not come from validation. It came from years of doing difficult work in unforgiving conditions, often unseen, often unrecognized. They had learned long ago that excellence did not require applause. As conversations continued, small details began to surface. How they read the terrain, how they moved without forcing it, how they trusted one another without constant verbal confirmation. These were not tricks learned in a single course. They were habits built over lifetimes shaped by struggle, faith, and responsibility to something larger than self. One French operator later admitted, quietly, that what unsettled him most was not losing the exercise. It was realizing how wrong his assumptions had been. He had expected to teach. Instead, he had been taught. Not through lectures, but through experience, through being outpaced by patience, outseen by awareness, outsmarted by humility. As the sun lowered and the jungle shifted color, the atmosphere changed. What began as a joint exercise ended as something closer to brotherhood. Shared water bottles, short conversations, mutual glances that carried understanding beyond language. The laughter that returned was different now. It carried no edge, only respect. In that moment, the transformation was complete. Not just tactical, but internal. The Philippines was no longer a footnote in someone else's doctrine. It was a reference point. A reminder that true strength is not always born from abundance, but from endurance, from faith under pressure, from learning to stand firm without needing to stand above others. And for those who witnessed it, that lesson would not fade easily. Because once a belief is broken by truth, it can never be fully rebuilt the same way again. Long after the jungle fell silent and the exercise became just another entry in official records, the impact remained alive in quieter places. It lived in conversations held late at night, in messages sent home, in thoughts that returned uninvited during training back in Europe. For the French operators, the memory was not defined by defeat, but by awakening. Something fundamental had shifted. Not their confidence in themselves, but their understanding of what true excellence looks like when stripped of reputation and assumption. For the Filipino operators, life moved forward much as it always had. There were no headlines waiting for them, no public ceremonies, no expectation of praise. They returned to their routines, to families, to missions that rarely made the news. Yet something subtle lingered there too. A quiet confirmation that what they had built through years of sacrifice mattered. That their way of operating, shaped by hardship, faith, and responsibility, stood strong even when measured against the world's most respected forces. What made this moment powerful was never the score itself. 5-0 would eventually fade into trivia. What endured was the message behind it. That strength does not always announce itself with polished language or expensive equipment. Sometimes it is found in patience, in humility, in the ability to endure without bitterness. The Philippines did not win by overpowering anyone. It won by being deeply, unmistakably itself. In a world that often measures worth through dominance and display, this story offers a different lens. It reminds us that greatness can grow quietly, in places the world overlooks. That faith, carried through hardship, can sharpen the mind as much as it strengthens the spirit. That communities built on trust and resilience can produce individuals capable of extraordinary things without ever needing to boast about them. For many who hear this story, especially Filipinos, it resonates on a deeply personal level. It echoes the lives of parents who worked without recognition, of grandparents who endured war and poverty with prayer instead of complaint, of families who found joy even when circumstances offered little reason to smile. It affirms something long felt but rarely acknowledged. That dignity does not require permission from the world. And for those outside the Philippines, the lesson is equally clear. Respect cannot be assumed. It must be earned, through listening, through humility, through the willingness to question old narratives. The Filipino operators did not ask to be believed in. They simply showed what belief looks like when it is lived every day. In the end, this is not just a military story. It is a human one. A reminder that amid global uncertainty and division, there are still places where compassion, faith, and quiet excellence thrive together. The Philippines stands as proof that resilience is not a myth, that humility is not weakness, and that sometimes the most powerful forces in the world are the ones that never needed the world's approval to begin with.